Hi, everybody. Good morning. And this is John Carnell. I'm here to bring you another developer drop. So today's developer drop is actually going to walk through how to solve a pretty common problem I get from requests from users. And that's how to move bulk numbers of Genesys Cloud users from one queue to another queue. Now, a lot of times, especially with companies that have very dynamic contact centers, they'll want to be able to move groups of users um, for a particular group or skill or role between different queues, oftentimes deleting them off of one queue and putting them on another. Now, there's really three ways we can do this. The first way is obviously through the UI, but as anybody who's ever had to try to move large numbers of users in any user interface, this can become very quickly very, very cumbersome and hard to do. So um, the next option is to use our API and our SDK and actually write a script to go out and directly call our API or use our SDKs to carry out this task. And the third option is to use our command line interface. So what I'm going to do in this dev drop is I'm going to show you how to take our CLI and wrapper it with just a very little light level of Python code to do some of the chunking involved in processing large amounts of users, and then use the CLI to do the heavy lifting. Now, why use the CLI here? Well, the CLI is going to take care of auto pagination so that you don't have to worry about grabbing the next set of records every time you want to get it. You want to get the next page of data for users or groups. And it also allows us to go out and deal with the 429s and rate limiting that might occur if you're going out and trying to do a massive amount of data move. Any developer who's worked with our API will tell you that that's something you have to take into account right from the beginning, or you tend to run into some nasty little surprises. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through this Python script that I wrote. And again, I use Python here as a very simple control layer because there's just a lot of different moving pieces that we have to worry about in order to carry this task out. So I'm going to start with a script that's going to take three command line parameters: a group name, the name of the queue you want to move to, and the destination queue. And the first thing the script's going to do, we're going to go past all the functions that are written here, is we're going to take those those names that we pass in, those logical names, and we're going to translate them into Genesys Cloud GUIDs. Remember, Genesys Cloud uniquely represents every object within their system as a GUID, a globally unique identifier. So most people don't understand GUIDs or remember them or keep them in their head. If you did, I'd be very impressed. So what we're going to do is I've written a function here in my Python script that's going to go out and take a particular object type that we're going after, either a group or a queue, and we're going to take in the logical name and we're going to go look up using the CLI, the group ID. So let's go ahead, or excuse me, using the CLI, look at the GUID. So let's go ahead and now look at this getID function. The getID function is actually really, really simple. We bring in the type of Genesys Cloud object we're looking for, and then the name of the object we're looking for. And because all of our objects in our CLI follow a pretty standard naming pattern, we're able to externalize this into a single string where we do a little bit of string injection. So I'm doing a GC, passing in the type of thing I'm looking for and the name, setting the page size, going through, and then using JQ to go out and query the name of the thing that we're looking for, and then dump the ID out and return that ID. Now in here, you can see I'm using an execute function, and all this execute function is doing is it's going out and wrappering the Python calls to be able to shell out to a shell script and process the results. So in here, it's just this way I can handle everything in a standard fashion, right? I open up my sub-process library in Python, I pipe the command out to it, I get the results. If I get an error back, I print the error out and I exit. Otherwise, I return the results. So the getID gets those results and strips off the carriage return that comes back from that particular Python call, and I'm good to go. Now, a couple things to note in here that I wanted to call out is you might have noticed in this list call, I'm passing in a -a option. Before the Genesys Cloud CLI version 3, we did auto pagination every time you did a list object. So we would go out and we would do all the auto pagination, pull all the data together from all the calls out to our API into a single piece of memory, and then write it out to standard out. We decided not to have auto pagination turned on by default. One is because we didn't want a situation where somebody accidentally was downloading like 1,000,000 records. Even though we have rate limiting in there, you might not actually need that. And so we're going to make you explicitly say, yes, I want to use auto pagination. The second thing is we also added the ability to stream results out. So when you call the list command, I'm using a -a to auto paginate, but it waits until it gets all the data back together and then dumps it out to standard out in one big JSON blob. With a stream command, we go and we print out the standard out each individual record. So it's just something to be aware of. If you're using an older version of the CLI before version 3, I would highly recommend that you upgrade because otherwise you'll have to change the script. So, okay, we've gone out and we've gotten our different IDs, our different GUIDs that we're going to need to work with. So now we're going to use the GC members list command, and we're going to pass into that list command the group ID that we just looked up for the logical group name we passed into the script. Now, this particular command goes out and returns user objects for all the users that belong to this group. And what we're doing is we're redirecting the output into the users in group.json file located in the export folder. Now, why did we do this? We could have just as easily done this with an API call and file handling and the file API in Python. Well, we did this because it's easier. A lot of times when we were doing administrative tasks or ad hoc tasks, we just want to get a script done and have it work quickly. And why not take advantage of a lot of the core operating system calls rather than writing a bunch of scripts over and over and over again using the APIs? Now, there's good reasons, and we'll get into this at the end of the talk, about why we would use the API or the SDK versus the CLI. But for now, we're just going out and we're taking all of these users and dumping them out into a file called users in group. Now, we also need to know how many users are actually part of that group. And the reason being is the API command that we're using with our CLI basically limits you to being able to add 100 users at a time in an API call. So we need to be able to look at how many users are in our group. We need to figure out the number of users. And then what we need to do is we need to chunk that list of user IDs into groups of 100 so that we don't go over that and cause our API calls to error out. It's one of those little idiosyncrasies in our APIs, but regardless, whatever platform you're going to work with, you're always going to find these little edges and knobs that go into this. So I bring this up because this is why we're doing this. And this is actually one of the reasons why I ended up writing a little bit of Python code here, is because I needed to be able to handle the iteration of that. So now at this point, I've identified all of my IDs associated with my groups and the queues that I want to move from and to. I've gotten a list of all my users that belong to that particular group. And then I've got the number of users that were returned when I went and dumped out the members of that group. So now I'm going to begin my migration. So what I'm doing here, before we get into move users in queue, basically what I'm doing is I'm going to move a block of users to the new queue, and then I'm going to delete those users off the old queue. And that's what we see here is if we're passing move users to queue and pass in false, then what we're doing is we are moving those users to the new queue. If we pass in true, we're deleting those users off the queue. So I'm always doing it in kind of this batch mode. Now, this goes a little bit more complicated because I have to handle the case where we have less than 100 users. In that case, I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to send all the users IDs that I've generated. And I'm going to put them out there and send them on their way. Now, the second half of this loop deals with the case where, or the second half of the if statement deals with the case where we have more than 100 users and we have to do some chunking. So what I'm doing is I'm going to go out here. I am going to move, I'm going to take the total number of users, divide them by 100 to get my total number of pages that I would have to send to add them to the queue and delete them from the queue. And I'm going to add +1 to it. Because if I just take 100 and divide the count by 100, I could end up tagging off like 25 or 50 users. In my particular use case that I'm going to show you guys, I've got 8,250 users that belong to a particular group. And without adding +1 to this, I'm going to miss those last 50 users. So once I get that, I am going to get the user index. And what I'm going to do is that is going to be the start of the block that I want to move. And the user final is going to be end of the block. So now let's go through and let's look at the move users queue call. It's actually a very, very simple piece of logic. But what I am going to do here is I am passing in the start of the user block I want to move, the end of the user block I want to grab. I want to take the queue ID I want to move the users to, and then I'm passing a flag in saying whether or not we're going to delete users or add users. And that delete users flag, when set to true, is going to delete the users. Otherwise, we're just going to add those users to the queue. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, I'm building the body of what I want the output to be for my call here. So I want the ID, the username, and joined equals true. And then if I'm going out and I want to add users, all I'm going to do is I'm going to cat the file that I was working with, the users in group. I'm going to pass it to JQ, and I'm going to take those user index and user final values, and I'm going to pop them into here using string interpolation in Python and say, okay, go and look for in that file, starting at this point in the JSON blob and ending at this point, those values, and then transform that data by using this map function. So what's going to happen is I've catted the file, I've grabbed the chunk of users, and I basically put that data in a format that my GCQ users move command that I'm now using is going to take as input. And that's exactly what's happening here. As I go GCQ users move, taking this input for that block, and I basically just created. I've piped it in here from this command into here. I do my string interpolation at the end, and I get a fully formatted GC users command that I can go ahead and execute on. And that's what this execute command does. Now, if I want to delete the user, then what I have to do is I have to basically do the exact same command, except I'm going to pass in a query parameter of delete equals true. All right, because in our Genesys Cloud API and our CLI, the exact same code that we the exact same API is used for both adding and removing users. So that being said, let's go out and actually go ahead and run this code. So I've got two queues out there, and I've got one large group, and the group is called Extra Jumbo Group 0. Extra Jumbo Group 0 contains 8,250 users. So I want to be able to search for that group, find its specific group ID, and then I want to move all the users that are currently in queue 20 over to queue 21. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. I'm going to talk for a little bit because this takes a while for it to run, because there's some things I came across that I think it's important to share with people as we're working through this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and it's going to go ahead and start gathering up the data. Probably one of the longest parts of the script is to get all the users in the queues, because this is a very, very big organization with a lot of users and groups. Most organizations that I've worked with aren't going to have 8,000 users in a single group. So a couple of things that were interesting that came out of this is, first, this really kind of gave me a chance to talk about and to think about when should I use the API and the SDKs versus CLI commands. And the way I like to look at it is the CLI tool is really developed and is geared towards its sweet spot is ad hoc querying and being able to do some lightweight data transformation and carry out bulk administrative commands. That's its sweet spot. So if I've got a script where I've just got to do a little bit of data transformation or maybe some control logic, or excuse me, a problem where I've got to do a little bit of control logic, then it makes a lot of sense to use the CLI and maybe combine it with a scripting language with Python, PowerShell, or Shell script. Personally, I use Python because every time I use Shell script, I just end up in a frustrated mess and then end up reaching for Python. So that's kind of where I start from. Now, what I tell people is the CLI was never really designed to be used in doing heavy data transformations, enterprise level, like really, really big integrations with a lot of reliability and resilience in them, or in scripts with a lot of conditional logic in it. What I found personally is while I can whip together a real simple script wrapping a couple of CLIs, if I get to the point where I have to do heavy data transformation, a lot of conditional logic, or I've got to make this a really big resilient integration, I'm probably better off using the API to begin with. Because remember, what the CLI does is it makes things simple for administrative tasks. And out of the box, it does auto pagination and it handles rate limiting. But there's kind of a trade-off. If I'm just wrapping the CLI all over the place, I end up eventually, if I have to do all this other logic, writing almost as much code as if I use the API. So I generally tell people, once your script starts getting over, 100 lines of code or meets those conditions where it's heavy business logic, heavy data transformation, go to the API. If you're getting over 100 lines of code, it's kind of a judgment call. But anything less than 100 lines of code is a pretty good indication that you could get away with just using the CLI to do the work. All right, so now we can see out here that we have got our move users call going, and it's moving the batches now one by one. So we're in the phase where we've actually got all the users downloaded for a particular group. We're batching the file 100 users at a time, and we're sending it to our API. One other thing that I learned out here too is you might be asking, why did I go out and do a members list? Let me get this, GC groups member list to get my list of users in the group. Why don't I just dump all the users using the GC users list command and then just cycle through it using, or query through it and filter using JQ? The reason being is GC users list has an expand option on it, which lets you pull in additional data like group, role, skills, so on and so forth. There's a little hidden gotcha in using that API. And that's the fact that that API actually doesn't all gather the data all together in one service. It grabs the user data, and then for each user record, it goes out and calls other services to get that data. If those other calls get rate limited or failed, the user API will not include those modules for that specific user inside the return JSON. It will return a 200. And if you're looking for group information, it will not return the group information. All right. It won't for that particular user. So as an outcome of that is we often run into situations where those users kind of have an inconsistent view if you're getting errors because of rate limiting or whatever on those downstream calls. So I always tell people, if you want to make sure that you have the list, use the target thing that you're going after, like GC groups members list or GC skills members, or so on and so forth. Okay, so our script is all done. So let's go take a look at another thing that I kind of came across while working on this. So if I go out here, this is a queue that we were moving everything to. And if you look, the member count that we have being returned by that queue from the CLI is 4,050. And that doesn't make sense because we were really moving 8,250 users. So where did the rest of those users go? Well, anytime we're adding, this is an idiosyncrasy of the queue members add API, is anytime we're adding those batch of 100 users, we're sending out background messages to other services saying that user has been added to the queue. One of those services is responsible for member count. And so right now, it is still logged. It's got a backlog of members that it's trying to add to, and it hasn't updated the member count yet. For large numbers of users, when you're adding those users to a new queue, it can take a couple minutes for the member count to get updated. So if I look at the other queue out there, I can see that we're starting to delete users off that queue. But for the GC members, I'm just sitting out there and I'm waiting for those items to get processed. So that's one thing to be aware of, because it kind of threw me for a loop when I was doing some testing of the script, because I was using the member count as an indication as to whether or not the users were actually being moved. The member count, again, gets updated asynchronously in a batch queue messaging format. So it might take a while for those messages to get processed, especially if if that particular downstream service behind user gets backed up. All right, so that's pretty much all I have to talk about this script. Now you can find this script out in our Genesys Cloud CLI repo. I'm going to stop my screen for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to bring a new screen up and I'm going to show that to you guys. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to bring this up and then I'm going to open this page. All right, so what we've got here is our Genesys Cloud Quick Hits repo. And this is just a general repository that we have out there for capturing any kind of good scripts or anything that we've come up with or SEs have come up or even other customers have come up with. So for the particular thing that we were working with, being able to move users between queues, you can actually go out there and see the Python script out here. You can also see other examples where we kind of use the shell script format. This isn't an actual working shell script. This is kind of a list of the steps we took that you could do it in shell. Remember my comments before about my frustration level with shell and eventually switching to Python? So that was one of the reasons why is I wanted an actual script I could show people. So you can go out here, you can download this script. It's open source. We welcome PRs to it. So if you have anything that you're doing that you want to share with our CLI, we'd love to have it. You know, I'm a Python developer, Java developer, Golang developer. Don't do much on Windows. If anybody wants to contribute a PowerShell version of the script, I would love it. So we welcome PRs. All right, so that pretty much wraps up our DevDrop. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or concerns about the code, please feel free to go out to the forum. We now have a forum category for the CLI, and we welcome comments and feedback. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.